When the AIDS epidemic hit the world, it especially hit Southern Africa. The very worst hit country was the small nation of Swaziland. 23% of all children in the country were orphaned. Faced with this devastating pandemic, a group of church leaders and Christian businessmen came together and proposed a radical idea. Why not buy an abandoned mining town and create a new community of blended families to care for hundreds of broken and abandoned AIDS orphans? The remarkable story of Bulembu and its lessons for the global church is what we will talk about on today's Lessons from Legends program.
The host of Lessons from Legends, Dr. Baron Gilfillan, was the TV producer for evangelist Reinhard Bonnke. Seeing multitudes saved and healed at Bonnke's crusades inspired him to create a discipleship program for the Global Harvest, an international school of ministry known as the ISOM. ISOM is now the world's largest video Bible school with 20,000 training sites in 150 nations. Instructors on the program include more than 100 legendary teachers from the global body of Christ, including Jack Hayford, John Bevere, Joyce Meyer, Reinhard Bonnke, A.R. Bernard, and T.L. Osborne. In this podcast, Dr. Baron breaks down specific essential lessons he's learned over 30 years from these legends of the Christian faith in a concise, personal, and easy-to-understand way. So, here is today's Lessons from Legends podcast with your host, Dr. Baron Gilfillan.
Hi, welcome to Lessons from Legends. I'm your host, Dr. Baron Gilfillan, and today is going to be somewhat different because we're going to go and visit Southern Africa. We're going to look at the city of Bulembu in the country of Swaziland. And, I want to just lay the context of this, that back in the 80s and 90s, there was a horrific AIDS epidemic. It may have started in other parts of the world, but probably the worst hit part of the world was Southern Africa, and especially the country of Swaziland. Now, Swaziland, if you can think about this, 23% of all the children in the entire country of Swaziland were orphaned. And the life expectancy rate of the entire country was only 32. And, facing a pandemic, an epidemic of this type of proportion, it really threw the church into a very, very, panicked situation. And they realized that, they needed to be a part of the solution. As we have been producing material from around the world, we've been creating curriculum content. We started with producing material that was on, the Bible training. It was Old and New Testament survey and all kinds of Bible courses. The ISOM is a rich, amazing program. But we started with Bible training. And then as we developed, we began to specialize and go into church planting and leadership development. And then we went into children's ministry and youth ministry, and we began to now move into developing a women's curriculum. We developed then a community development program, and then we began to develop a bachelor's program. And that bachelor's program, we started to look at Israel, and we looked at the whole Messianic module with Perry Stone. We went and began to record, in the area of sexuality and family and counseling and all these other areas, even the area of apologetics. But we ended up coming to a place where we came across a teaching called the Seven Mountain Strategy, and it was by Lance Wallnau. It was originally something given to both Bill Bright from Campus Crusade and Lauren Cunningham from Youth with a Mission, called the Seven Mountain Strategy. And that strategy really, dealt with the church now moving into society, moving into the areas of business and of politics and of education and, the arts and entertainment, family, as well as the media. All of these areas were important for the church to now begin to engage, all 7 areas that are important for the church to engage in society. And when we began to understand that, we began to look around the world and say, God, who is doing this? Who is really doing this on a major level? And we began to record content on the marketplace. The marketplace to us were the people that really, are Christians, but they are called into a different sector than the church. But they're called to express their faith in all of these areas of society. And so we began to now engage that type of teaching. Now, one of the people we recorded was Paul Cuny. He taught on the two books of Ezra and Nehemiah in the Old Testament. And just to give you a quick summary, the book of Ezra deals with the restoration of the temple. In the Old Testament, the children of Israel were exiled for 70 years, and now they were coming back to Jerusalem. The first thing God did was to send Ezra, and he sent all of the ingredients, all of the vessels and the things that they had stolen from the temple that Nebuchadnezzar had taken. Ezra brought a lot of that material back to Jerusalem, and then he began the process of building the temple. I mean, it took many, many years, and it was a very difficult process. But Ezra rebuilt the temple, and he brought back worship, he brought back sacrifice, and he did all of that. However, many years later, after the temple had been established, Nehemiah was back with the king, back in Babylon. And he was waiting for a report to come from Jerusalem, and people arrived, and he said, "How are things going? How is that temple going? How's the church going?" Which was a picture of the church, that Old Testament temple. And when he then heard the report, he began to weep and to cry, because the people said, "The church is broken down, the temple's broken down." But the report was very, very negative. And Nehemiah heard that the temple was not doing well. The people were being ravaged. The people were being destroyed. There was no prosperity. There were armed robbers and people that were invading the city. And, Nehemiah began to weep and to cry, because he was a marketplace person. And for the first time in his life, he exuded a sadness before the king. And the king said, "Nehemiah, what's going on?" And Nehemiah said, "I need to go back to Jerusalem. Please send me back and let me rebuild the walls. Let me rebuild, the infrastructure. Let me go back to Jerusalem." And the king gave him permission. Now, Nehemiah did not ask for vessels. He did not ask for the things for the temple. He asked for resources. He asked for letters of authority. He asked for letters to the governors. He asked for letters to be able to get timber and other things from the other provinces. And he was given an entourage, he was given protection, and he went back and he became the governor. And in 52 days, after the city's been lying dormant for about 120 years, in 52 days, the marketplace person rebuilt the walls, and Nehemiah established protection. He established the prosperity of the city. He began to organize and to govern resources. He began to govern food and how it was distributed. He established the protection of the city, and he began to build the infrastructure so that the temple could, it could prosper and it could function. Now, that concept, you cannot have Ezra without Nehemiah. You cannot have the church without the business community. We need a cooperation between these two. And that's what's so important, so powerful of what happened in Swaziland, is that the church, which was a man by the name of Kevin Ward, he headed up an amazing church in the capital of Imbabane, and he was a pastor, he was a leader, but he also was a marketplace person. Even being a church leader, he was the chairman of the board of one of the major banks in the country. And so he was both a businessman, but he was a church leader. But in his congregation, he had marketplace people. In fact, he had a man by the name of Neil Rakenberg, who was a timber expert and a person who just had a tremendous acumen and understanding of entrepreneurship and of business development. And the two joined together and created Bulembu. They looked around and said, how can we take care of hundreds of orphan children? And they came across a town that was an abandoned mining town. It had 10,000 people originally, but the city of Bulembu had originally housed an asbestos mine. And this town had been abandoned because the mine had gone bankrupt. It had given up its business, and they sold everything, and the mine still owned the town, but everybody had left. It was a ghost town. And they approached the owners of Bulembu, and they said, can we buy the town? They raised funding from overseas, from Canada and from the US and UK, and they put together a plan, and they purchased the city and the town of Bulembu. They now went about building the infrastructure, and they had to build, the ability for this town to function and to be practical. They had incoming support from overseas, and they used those resources to establish 7 businesses. Now, it's very important to realize that they knew that just establishing the feeding of these children, all the care of these children was not enough. They needed to establish a marketplace infrastructure. Now, the first business they established was the timber business. Neil Rakenberg brought his expert, and to me, he is a legend in the faith because he has become one of the great counselors even to the king of Swaziland, and he is somebody who has become raised up by God as literally like a Joseph in the land. And Neil Rakenberg, he brought in the timber business, and they established timber in the area of the city of Bulembu. And then secondly, they established a water business because they realized that they had, water coming, and it was spring water coming out of the mountain. They raised the funds for a bottling plant, and they were able to establish a water business. And Bulembu water is now famous throughout the entire, country of Swaziland. People buy that water. And then they realized that they had other resources. They had bees in the area, so they established an apiary, and they had hundreds of beehives. They knew that the children were going to need milk, and they were going to need meat, and so they began to develop a dairy, and that became a major development. And then they knew that the children were going to need bread, and they had to establish a bakery so that they were going to get bread as well as pastries and other things that the kids would need. Now, in addition to those ones, they added a craft business, and they also added a lodging business because as Bulembu grew, people came from around the world to see what was going on. And so there they established a magnificent lodging business that became also a place where people could have retreats and people could have conferences and conventions. Now, this was an amazing infrastructure that they now began to bring in the children. They started with the infants, and they began to take in older children, and then it went into kindergarten, and then to preschool, and then from there, they went up to elementary, and from elementary, they went into middle school, and middle school, they went into high school, and they began to take in children. The children came from all parts of the country. Some of them came that had been orphaned, had literally come out of gutters. They took in the broken. They took in the people that nobody else wanted to take in. The government began to give them children, and places that just didn't know what to do with these orphans. They began to take these kids in. And now they began to build a family, a community, because they needed, families. They needed parents. They needed people to take care of these kids. So they got house mothers. Now they had hundreds of these homes that had been abandoned, and they began to take them one by one and turn each of these homes. They put a house mother and 8 children in each home. And now they began to create blended families that they could now develop these kids into a place where they could begin to function as a community. Now, this was an amazing project, and Bulembu began to grip. It began to take root, but they were still being supported massively from outside. And it was at that point that they realized they needed to establish the church at the heart of the community. And so they brought in a pastor, and they established a church. But that is when their first major opposition took place. They put this church in place, and the person who had been supporting them in the tune of hundreds of thousands of dollars from overseas, he came and he saw the church, and he said, "Look, I'm supporting this, but I'm not going to support the church." He said, "I love Jesus, but I don't love the church. And he said, I cannot continue to support you if you establish a church. So you make a choice. Choose the church or choose the money. Now, that is a choice that you and I are going to probably have to face at some point in our lives. And that's probably the first major lesson I learned from Bulembu. I learned that, God is your source. And at some point, whatever happens in your life, the enemy will tempt you to choose to trust in mammon, or, the alternative is to trust in God. And the enemy will do everything he can to try to get you to look to the source of your resources. He will try to get you to embrace those. And we have to, as believers, we have to make the difficult choice of choosing to trust in God. Now, it's one thing for you and I to do it as an individual, but it's another thing when you've got hundreds of orphan children in your care, and you realize that, their sustenance and their feeding and their clothing and their, source of being able to survive is coming from outside. And you are now faced with the choice of putting a church and establishing God's kingdom versus accepting those resources. It was a stark choice. And the leaders of Bulembu, and especially Kevin Ward and Neil Rakenberg, I have such respect for them because they made the decision to trust God. They made the decision to turn their back on hundreds of thousands of dollars a month, and they decided to put their full weight of strength, of trust in the Lord. And when they did that, it was like a hand of God came underneath the community, and God began to cause their businesses to grip. And suddenly they began to get orders for timber and for water and for the honey and for all the resources that they had there. And those resources now began to grip, and people began to join from outside, from around the world in other countries, began to hear about Bulembus, began to support individually the children. And they pieced together, and somehow they survived the first month, and then they survived the second, and then the third, and then it began to grip. And what a testimony it was that God's provision is secure and it's true and you can trust it. You may be suffering from the loss of a job right now. Your source of income may have dried up. Maybe it's a business that's gone under. It may be some other way that you've lost that source of income. But let me tell you, you need to trust God. You need to put your full faith in Him, because God is the source of every provision in the earth. And God is the one who is the real source. He is the only source that will never dry up. He is the only source that can undergird you and help you to sustain and to survive. And so they saw in Bulembu that God helped them to survive, and what a tremendous lesson that was. Now, the second thing I want to just point out, and I've covered it, but I want to just make it as a major point, that the church and the marketplace need to partner together, that this partnership is tremendously important. There's so many times that you have the church and then you have the marketplace people, and the marketplace people come and the pastors simply say, you know what, you just need to give us your money. We'll do the spiritual side. You guys go and make the money and we'll take care of things. And, it's not supposed to be like that. We're supposed to have a divine partnership together. We need Ezra and Nehemiah. We need both of these to come together, and we need them to work integrated in a way that complements each other. Now, that partnership is what happened in Bulembu, and it worked. It created the infrastructure for hundreds of AIDS orphans, which brings me to the third thing that I really want to just touch on, is that the businesses that came to Bulembu brought more than just, provision for the needs of the community. They gave so much more because they now gave jobs. They were able to bring in skills, and they were able to bring in people who would now work in the community. They also brought dignity, that, the people were not just, getting all their support from outside. The people now could see that the work of their hands was providing for their needs. We see as well that these jobs provided a skill development, which as kids were now graduating from the high school, they could go into skill development. They could apprentice in these jobs, and that they could learn skills, and that they were then now being prepared for society and for the job market. And we see that the community was able to be uplifted because it was taking care of itself. And this was an incredible lesson that came out of the businesses, was that they provided much more than resources. They also provided an upliftment for the entire people that lived and worked in that city. It also brought men into the picture, because many of the men that came to work those jobs now complemented the families that were being established. And this provided also role models for the boys that were growing through the program. And it was just such an amazing factor that all of those elements came with the establishment of businesses at the heart of the Bulembu model. And there's one final thing I want to share, and that is that Bulembu is a prototype. We went and created a documentary because we saw Bulembu as a prototype. This was a model. It was a practical model. That is, how can we partner together, the church as well as the marketplace, to create creative solutions that really answer and don't just put a Band-Aid on problems. They go to the root and they fix things at their foundation. One of the most inspiring examples of that is the Homeboy Industries. It's actually based here in Los Angeles, in California. And, this was the result of a pastor. He was a Catholic priest, and his name was Gregory Boyle. And he was pastoring a mission church in Los Angeles. In fact, in one of the worst gang areas. He was pastoring in an area that had, one of the largest public housing projects west of the Mississippi. Here in Los Angeles, they're known for, violence, and they're known for a lot of people dropping out of school, and people getting into drugs, and people getting into gang violence. And he saw the problem, and he realized that he couldn't just, pray for them and be nice to them. They were not going to change unless they foundationally changed at the root of what was happening in their lives. This is what it says about this program. Currently, employment is offered for more than 180 men and women through a thoughtful, strategic 18-month program that focuses on healing just as much as it focuses on developing work readiness skills. And they say their overarching goal is to see individuals heal from trauma, allowing them to contribute fully to their family and community. The 5 key outcomes we strive for as an organization are: number 1, reduce recidivism; 2, reduce substance abuse; 3, improve social connectedness; 4, improve housing safety and stability; and 5, reunify families. These are just practical ways that this partnership is accomplishing the healing of the heart, as well as the healing of the family, and the healing of people's skills and abilities and their ability to function in society. And this brings me to all of us, because, we need holistic type of approaches to things. We need to recognize that no one group and no one organization can do things alone, that we need both the marketplace and the church. We need these two to recognize each other, to recognize the skills that each bring. And there are many, many other examples of this, but I felt like Bulembu and the Homeboys Industry, to me, are two very, very complementary type of organizations. They're doing their part, but I believe they provide a prototype for each of us. As we close out this program, I want to pray with you. To me, this is such an exciting prospect. I know that we need to have bold plans and big thinking. One of the things about Bulembu, who thinks of buying a town? I mean, who thinks of, creating this type of infrastructure and starting these kind of businesses? But we need bold and we need very creative thinking to solve the issues that our society is facing. these can't just be things that we turn a blind eye to, or, oh, it's not my place and I shouldn't be involved in that. We need actually to agree together that the church will recognize the marketplace will recognize the church, that we're not in opposite ends of a spectrum. We are together in the same battle. We need both the Ezra and the Nehemiah. We need to partner together, and together we can create prosperity. Together we can bring healing. Together we can get things done, and we can make changes in society, that are going to impact our world around us. So let's agree together that God would do something new. And Lord, I just thank you for every person that's listening to this who may never have heard of Bulembu, a small town in the country of Swaziland that was ravaged, a country that was ravaged by the AIDS epidemic. Lord, I just pray, God, that we, in our own situations, with the problems that we face in our cities, in our towns, in our communities, God, that we would trust you for creative plans, that we would have a reconciliation between the marketplace people, and that they would feel included in the purposes of God. They are just as needed. Lord, we need both the Ezras and the Nehemiahs. And Lord, I pray, God, that the church people would also recognize that this is a divine partnership. We can do more together than we could ever do apart. And so, Father, I pray for this restoration. I pray for creative ideas. I pray for bold plans. I pray for unusual resources, God, to come from amazing places, God, that you are the source. You are a provider. And I ask you, God, to give us vision. Give us, Lord, a passion. And Father, give us a divine plan to solve the problems of our communities and of our countries in the name of Jesus. Amen. And so until next time, from Lessons from Legends, Dr. Berenguer Fullen, God bless you.
If you've enjoyed this podcast and you have a hunger to learn more from these legends of the Christian faith, please check out the iSOM at isomonline.org. You can get an associate, bachelor's, or master's degree, each in as little as a year. Get trained for ministry, get an award that's globally recognized, and learn from some of the best teachers in the world. Check out isomonline.org today. Please subscribe to Lessons from Legends on the Charisma Podcast Network, cpnshows.com, and Apple Podcasts, and give us a 5-star review. A visual version of Lessons from Legends and many of the referenced videos and documentaries can be found on YouTube at youtube.com/ministry degree, or by simply searching Ministry Degree on the YouTube site. Also, check us out and follow the audio versions on Google Podcasts and Google Play, Spotify, and YouTube.